Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight. This is a wonderful turnout. Jen, you are a draw. This is incredible. This is our first Connector series in a long time, and it's wonderful to see such a wonderful turnout. Thank you. I just want to do a little introduction, so bear with me for a bit. And I'm going to welcome everybody. There are still some seats available that I can see, so grab a seat and make yourselves cozy and comfortable. Welcome, everyone. I'm Liz Wiley. I'm the Executive Director of the Marion Institute. On behalf of the board, the advisory board, and the team, I want to welcome everyone to this evening's Connector Series event. Just got very dim in here. I can't see your faces. So I feel like I'm like the girl behind the, I don't know. I feel like I'm hiding. These public educational events, what we affectionately call our Connector Series, focuses on topics of interest to us all. They're one of the ways that the Marion Institute maintains a learning stance in our work and an open door for friends old and new to join us in the impactful work that we do. That's what tonight is and what our Summer Climate Series is all about. It's an open door. It's an invitation to get to know us at the Marion Institute. We invite you to learn more about our team and the work that we're doing and to learn more about how climate change is affecting our communities, our oceans, and our food supply across the globe and specifically here on the South Coast. Before I turn it over to Jen Francis, who I know you're all going to love and are eager to hear from, I want to briefly touch upon the work that we do at the Marion Institute. We're a social justice nonprofit about to celebrate our 30th anniversary. Our work is grounded in the interconnectedness of people, place, and planet, all caring for one another. And our mission is to advance a culture of learning and health, support individual health, build resilient communities, and advocate for food justice and nutritional security. I hope you've had a chance to visit those boards in the back and some of my team this evening. If you guys can all give a little shout, Marion Institute team. This is all possible because of all of them, everything that you're going to hear about. And also had a chance to look through our annual reports that you found on your chairs. So you'll have a little idea about our programs, our Biomed program, our Grow Education, and our South Coast Food Policy Council. But I'm going to just share a little bit more on each of those. Access to healthy food and environments are the threads that weave through the Marion Institute's programs. Our Biomed program elevates the three pillars of biological medicine: nutrition, detoxification of our internal terrain and our external environments, and immune building with the goal of bringing our bodies back into homeostasis and good health. The Marion Institute's Grow Education program offers a hands-on, experiential approach to fostering community health that engages students and schools in farm-to-school-based programming. This learning model reaches youth, our children and grandchildren, as they're just beginning to independently choose and be mindful of what they eat, where their food comes from, and the impact that different food has on how they feel. Our work takes a broader, more systemic view of nutrition and community health through the work we do with the South Coast Food Policy Council. This work is about making sure that all of us on the South Coast, regardless of socioeconomic status, has access to healthy, local, culturally relevant fresh foods. Working with our food system stakeholders and using the Food System Assessment Report for Southeastern Mass that we published back in fall of 2021, we've identified key priorities and initiatives focused on capacity and infrastructure, increased food access, advocacy for food policies, and educating our constituents about our local food system and the importance of being an active participant in that system. Climate change impacts, an over-reliance on the industrialized national food system, labor shortages, and the economics of inflation contribute to rising costs incurred by farmers and fisheries and are all passed down to us, the consumers. This is being reflected in the rising rates of food insecurity we have seen since the beginning of the pandemic and still see today. These are some stats from our food system assessment. 1 in 3 residents in Massachusetts is food insecure. That means they don't know where their next meal is coming from, with children being most impacted. 1 in 3 consumers surveyed for our assessment said they often or sometimes run out of food before they have money to buy more. And current rates of food insecurity, what we're seeing today, are back to the devastating high numbers we saw during the pandemic of March 2020. I'm particularly interested to hear Jen's thoughts on climate impacts on agriculture, but before I turn it over to Jen, I want to share a few words about the Marion Institute's newest program. It's so new, it's not on our website, and it's not really even in our annual report. There's a little blip about it. But growing out of the work of the Southcoast Food Policy Council and in response to the alarming rates of food and nutritional insecurity in our region, I am so proud to announce the Marion Institute's newest program, the Neighborhood Farm at Frogfoot. The Neighborhood Farm, located on the Wareham-Plymouth line, is made possible by a partnership with the A.D. Makepeace Company. Through a multi-year, low-cost lease agreement, the Marion Institute will create, manage, and operate a farm, a 6-acre plot, previously unused farmland land on ADM property. The MI will be responsible for operating the Farm to Food Relief program, so that means that all the food that's grown on those 6 acres will go directly to food relief, and for establishing a regional volunteer gleaning program. Every year, thousands of pounds of food go to waste in the field because farmers either don't have the labor to harvest the crop or they don't have a market to sell it to. The Marion Institute's trained gleaning volunteers will rescue the food that would otherwise go to waste in the field, delivering it to local food pantries or commercial kitchens to be made into prepared meals for food insecure individuals and families. Our food pantries are critical resources for our communities, but unfortunately, they primarily distribute shelf-stable, ultra-processed foods that are suboptimal for good health. Frogfoot Farm and the volunteer gleaning program that will operate on it will dramatically increase the amount of fresh produce in our local pantries, and as we ramp up operations at Frogfoot Farm, we estimate we'll grow and rescue approximately 200,000 pounds of produce annually. The Neighborhood Farm at Frogfoot will strengthen the thread I spoke about earlier that connects all of the Marion Institute's programs and builds upon our long history of incubating local food initiatives, our belief in the power of food as medicine, and the foundation nutrition plays in individual and community health. We hope you will see this new program as an opportunity to get involved in our work as volunteers, supporters, and advocates. Now let me link Marion Institute's work to tonight's topic of climate change. As you've heard, individual and community health is directly linked to the food we eat and our local food system. However, on any given night, you can see on the news how our food system is being impacted by the climate. From droughts to floods to fires, these natural disasters not only impact food production, but also affect distribution, food access and consumption, and food waste and recovery. The EPA estimates that each year, U.S. food loss in the fields and food waste in our homes, our schools, our hospitals, restaurants, and institutions embodies approximately 170 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's equal to the annual CO2 emissions of 42 coal-fired power plants. And this estimate does not include the significant methane emissions, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, from food that's wasting in our landfills. Global climate change is not a future problem. It is a here, and we're experiencing its effects now. How do we address and prepare for climate impacts on the South Coast? How can we best do the work at the Marion Institute while being good climate stewards? What can each of us do individually to better support our climate? And with all the extreme weather we're experiencing and reading about, is there any hope? Where was my person tonight that was talking about hope? We need hope. To provide us with some greater context and answer these questions, I am so pleased to welcome and introduce Jennifer Francis. We have a lot of questions for you. Jennifer Francis is a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts. She's previously spent the 24 years as a research professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University, where she studied the Arctic climate system and how rapid Arctic change is affecting areas beyond the Arctic, particularly extreme weather in the Northern Hemisphere. Jennifer earned her BS in meteorology from San Jose State University in 1988 and her Ph.D. in atmospheric sciences from the University of Washington in 1994. She and her husband have circumnavigated the globe by sail during the early 1980s, including the Arctic, which is where sheer interest of the region began. They now live on their catamaran 8 months of the year, riding the winds to the Caribbean, Central America, and now the South Pacific. Jen, we're so pleased to have you here with us tonight. Please welcome Jen Francis with me to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm sorry to be up here behind this podium, but that's what they told me to do. It's so wonderful to look out there and see so many of my favorite faces from Marion, and thank you so much for being here on this beautiful July evening when I know a lot of you would rather be out there sailing on the bay in the beautiful breeze that's blowing. But this is kind of important stuff, so I'm really grateful that you're here. I'm going to talk about a lot of extreme weather. Rough weather ahead. Boy, what a great week to be talking about it. I mean, it's just been unreal, even for me, who kind of pays attention to this stuff all the time. But, you know, going back even just to May and June, the heat waves, and just in the last couple of weeks, the flooding right in our backyard in Vermont and New York and even in Western Massachusetts. We've been kind of in this little bubble. We're one of the few places in the country right now that hasn't experienced some kind of extreme weather. So I don't want to hear anybody complaining about the humidity. Not okay. So this rough weather ahead, this is an article that I wrote for Scientific American a couple of years ago. I'd be happy to distribute a PDF of it if you're interested in learning more after all this. And I think I probably should change the title to Rough Weather Behind, too, because we're already seeing all kinds of rough weather. Let's see, hopefully this is going to work from up here. Yeah, if you could sit here, please. I'm surprised it's not working. Can I take the microphone?
Yes.
And be down here?
Yes.
Oh, that's what I really like to do.
Then I'll do that.
The one on the left.
This one, okay. The right one? Okay, so RCTV okay with just one microphone? Because it'd be hard to hold two, but I could do that. All right, this is better. All right, so I want to start out with this piece of information here. This is going to blow your mind. I have a lot of bad news to tell you tonight. I'm sorry to say that. This might be the worst of all. The 11 hottest days ever recorded in the, well, not ever, but in the last over 100,000 years occurred just this month. The hottest days in over 100,000 years happened this month. That is staggering. And we know that extreme weather of all sorts is increasing.
Lift your left leg.
And it affects electronics.
And if it feels like extreme weather has been increasing, you are not imagining it. This graph is showing you, going back to 1980, how extreme events, weather events that have cost over $200 billion in damage have the numbers of those over this time period. And what you see is a very clear increase in the frequency of these major extreme events. All right, this is a problem. I mean, you might have to do it too. All right, so 2023, as we just talked about, has already been really packed with extreme events. Let's start with just last month. There was a major, just excruciating heat wave that hit Texas and Mexico. And we are watching this heat wave basically spread first to the east. It went and affected Louisiana, Florida, and now it has kind of sloshed back to the west again. We're seeing these record-breaking temperatures in Arizona as we speak. I think today was the 19th day in a row over 110 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona. just amazing. And getting back to what Liz was talking about, you know, this kind of heat, especially that lasts as long as it has, is absolutely devastating for agriculture, for people, for animals, you name it. This is really tough, and especially in places like Mexico and other countries where they just don't have the resources to cope. They don't have air conditioning, they don't have backup systems, they can't just pick up and leave. So this has been truly a devastating situation. And of course the fires up in Canada. You know, since May, I had to change this because at first I had up there in May. And now we're seeing these fires just continue and grow, and the extent of the fires in Canada this year have completely blown the record out of, I was going to say the water, but that's not really appropriate, I guess. But it's just been devastating. And of course, down here, we've been experiencing some of those effects. This is in New York City back in May, and that was a real wake-up call for New York City. They'd never had air quality that bad before, with that smoke being carried down from the Canadian wildfires. I don't really call them wildfires anymore because, as you'll see, I think they're not wild anymore. We have a big hand in these fires, so they need a different name. So what's going on? These two events, the heat wave I described and the fires, are connected. And it's all through the jet stream. People who know me well know that I talk about the jet stream all the time. And you're going to learn a lot about the jet stream tonight. I hope that's okay. The jet stream controls our weather. It makes our weather. It steers our weather. And that's the case with this example, too, that is responsible for the big heat dome. You've heard about heat domes that cause that a really long-lived extreme heat wave over the Texas and Mexico area that we were just talking about. And what you see is the jet stream is taking this very convoluted path as it goes across North America. It comes down from the North Pacific, dips down, and then takes a big bulge northward. We call that a ridge. The jet stream is basically the boundary between the cold air to the north and the warmer air to the south. So when we get one of these big bulges like that, it allows all that warm air to penetrate much farther north than it normally would. And when we get these really large convoluted waves in the jet stream, they tend to get stuck in place for a long time. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And you can also see that, just talking about connecting to the flooding that happened in our part of the world, that downward swing in the jet stream is responsible for creating storms and low pressure. So the flooding in the Northeast, the heat in the Midwest, they're all connected because of these big waves in the jet stream. And we can look back a little farther and remember the winter that we had out in the western states. They had record-breaking snowfall out there. It really wasn't expected. But that's what happened. And what we see as a result is that a multi-year drought that had been in place over the western states, and you see the bottom right image there, that's one of the biggest reservoirs in California, was basically empty. And then the picture right above it is what it looks like today. And that's after this one winter of very heavy rainfall on the coast and snowfall up in the mountains. So what did the jet stream have to do with that? Well, you're starting to catch on, I can tell, just by looking at you. This image is showing you what the jet stream looked like during these multi-years of drought. And you can see that it went up north into Canada, taking the storms with it, allowing that warm air from the south to penetrate much farther north, kept all the rain away from the western states for literally several years. And then we have the big dip that usually follows, we call that a trough. That usually is the downstream response to having a big ridge like that. So now let's look at what the jet stream looked like last winter. Just the opposite, right? Big southward dip, a big trough off the east coast. That brought the west coast. That brought the storms in from the Pacific Ocean, and it was, remember I said big waves tend to get stuck in one place for a long time, they tend to not move much. Both of those conditions were that. And so that situation this past winter was also very persistent, and that led to the perpetual storm after storm coming into the West Coast. Meanwhile, we were kind of high and dry over here in the east. One more example here. Remember back in February of 2021 when there was this extremely disruptive cold spell that hit most of the middle of the country. You remember the utility grid in Texas went down. The gas pipes froze there. During this really intense cold spell, which was also very long-lived, Dallas got down to -2 Fahrenheit. It was colder in Dallas than it was in many parts of Alaska and Greenland at the time. So, what do you suppose the jet stream looked like during this? Just as you imagined, I'm thinking. Now it's labeled storm track, but that's actually the jet stream that was in place at the time. A big southward dip, and of course in the wintertime, all that Arctic air penetrated way far south because that jet stream is the boundary. But you also see this other thing on the map there. The polar vortex. It sounds awful. And, everybody's heard about the polar vortex now. It really entered our dining room conversations a few years ago. But most people really don't know what it is. And tonight, you're going to learn what it is because it is misaligned by the media, by many people all the time. So you're going to learn tonight what the polar vortex is, and so you can teach everybody you know. All right. So here's a little schematic looking down on the North Atlantic there. Here's the United States off to the left. You see two circular things. The light blue colored one is representing the jet stream, which is what we've been talking about, right? That's responsible for all those extreme events that we were just talking about. The polar jet stream is about 5 to 9 miles high in the atmosphere. That's about up where jets are. That's why it's called the jet stream. It's never that circular. It's always got some waves in it, but we'll go with that. And it's there all the time. The jet stream is there all year round. The polar vortex is that little smaller circle farther to the north. And it is also a spinning river of wind that encircles some very cold air in the middle. But it's way up in the stratosphere. It's much higher, 10 to 30 miles above the surface. And it's only there in the wintertime. It's not there right now. It's not there in the summer. And most of the time, it sits up there, it spins around, it doesn't bother anybody, it just does its own thing, you don't even pay attention to it. However, sometimes the polar vortex becomes disrupted. And it can either get stretched in kind of a beam shape, or it can even split like this diagram has right here. And when that happens, we know that wild weather is going to start happening all around the northern hemisphere because those pools of cold air tend to drift southward. And when they do, like that white arrow was showing down over North America, it makes the jet stream also take a bigger dip. And that extra cold air that's up in that stratospheric polar vortex comes down, and it makes that cold spell that we're experiencing that much colder, that much more intense, and that much more persistent. That's exactly what happened during that Texas cold wave. So when the polar vortex gets disrupted, we know we're going to start seeing some extreme winter weather around and about. Now, interestingly, there's been some recent research suggesting that the polar vortex is becoming disrupted more often. Over time, it happens about once every 2 years, or once every 18 months on average. We're now seeing it happening more often, and we think it's connected to the loss of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. So that's some research that I've been involved with too, and we can talk more about that later if you want. All right, now I want to step back a little bit and kind of put this whole thing into perspective. And we're going to look at 20,000 years of the Earth's temperature. So on the left here is 20,000 years ago. The Earth was about 3 degrees colder then. That was when we had our last ice age.
That's when the ice came all the way down to Cape Cod. It covered most of Canada. The Earth was only 3 degrees colder on average. It doesn't take much to make a huge difference in how the Earth's climate system looks. And here, after that, then the Earth started to warm up. It reached a peak around 8,000 years ago, and then it started to cool off. So we're going towards present as we go that way. These changes were all caused by natural factors. For example, the Earth's orbit around the sun is not round. Sometimes it's more round, sometimes it's more elliptical, and those changes in the orbit can cause cooling and warming of the Earth's climate system. The tilt of the Earth relative to the sun changes over time too, and that can have an influence on the Earth's temperature. Those are the kinds of natural causes that create the climate changes, the ice ages, the interglacial periods that we've seen in the past. But as you get up towards the right side of this graph, you can see that something very, very different is going on. The Earth should be cooling right now if only natural factors were in play. But no, we are spiking in temperature. We're already well over 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than we were before we started dumping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if we keep going the way we're going, you can see we're getting up into the danger zone there, 2 degrees, maybe as much as 4 degrees if we keep doing what we're doing. And of course we know that as we warm the Earth, we are clearly expecting to see more heat waves. And this simple animation here explains why. Any place on Earth, whether it's Marion or whether it's the state or the country as a whole, has a distribution of temperature over its climatology. Sometimes it's colder, sometimes it's warmer. But if you take that distribution and shift it to the right, that is, warm the globe, then you can see that extreme heat section there, that red part, increases dramatically. It doesn't take much to make that frequency of those extreme events happen much more often. So it's totally connected. One of the clearest connections between climate change and heat waves is this just simple distribution shifting to the right. So of course we know why this warming is happening, because we've changed the composition of the atmosphere. This graph goes back 800,000 years on the left side there. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see it wiggled up and down over those many hundreds of thousands of years until we get over to the right side, which is the situation today. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now has not been seen in probably 3 million years. All of our evidence points to that. So the Earth's temperature really hasn't caught up to the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere already. So we've got a serious problem on our hands there. And that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are increasing in the atmosphere trap heat. They trap the heat that's emitted by the Earth, having been warmed by the sun. And over 90% of that heat that gets trapped actually goes into the ocean, not the atmosphere. And what we're seeing right here is going back to the 1950s, how the temperature, how much heat in the ocean has been changing. In the top 2,000 meters of ocean. It's just an amazing amount of heat that's getting stored into the ocean. That's going to come up again a little bit later. So one of the things that results from the oceans warming so much is that we get more evaporation from the oceans. And the air is warmer too, so it can hold more of that water vapor. The water vapor story is one that doesn't get much attention, and I think it deserves a whole lot more because it is a huge part of the climate change story. So this is just kind of a fun animation. It's showing you just a couple of weeks ago how much water vapor there is in the air all around the globe. And of course, you can see the orange areas are the tropics, where anybody who's been to the tropics knows it's really humid, there's a lot of water vapor in the air. But there's also some really fun little specific things going on there. If you can see North America, just off the coast of Baja there, that's Hurricane Calvin, which is just about to hit the big island of Hawaii. So these tropical storms, of course, have a lot of water vapor in them. Another interesting aspect, I think, are these filaments that come from the tropics and extend down into the higher latitudes. Those have been given the name atmospheric rivers. They're these conduits of tropical moisture that get carried way up into the higher latitudes, and it's one of the ways that the climate system helps keep itself in balance. And basically the job of storms is to take all that heat from the tropics and the moisture from the tropics and distribute it all over the higher latitudes. So, as I said, the oceans are warming, the atmosphere is warming, and as a result, we're seeing the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere increase. It's increased about 4% so far, since about 30, 40 years ago. This is a huge deal because water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas. It traps heat, just like carbon dioxide, and it traps way more than the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. So any increase in water vapor is just making the problem even worse. It's actually one of these vicious cycles or positive feedbacks you might have heard about in the climate system. So we warm the oceans, we warm the air, we evaporate more water vapor. That water vapor traps even more heat, which evaporates even more water vapor, and so this is what we mean by a positive feedback. That water vapor is also energy. When water vapor, which is a gas, condenses into droplets in a cloud, it releases a lot of heat into the air. That heat is the main fuel that storms feed off of. Hurricanes, nor'easters, thunderstorms, that's the main source of energy for storms. So by having more water vapor in the air, we're putting more energy into these storms. And it's also more moisture. And one of the other very clear signals of climate change is the increasing frequency of heavy downpours. Boy, did we see that this week, right? And you can see that the Northeast there has the biggest increase in the frequency of these heavy downpours of anywhere in the country. That's going back to the 1950s, a 55% increase in the frequency of heavy downpours. And in the winter, it appears that we're also seeing an increase, a recent increase in the frequency of heavy snowstorms. So each one of those colored dots there represents the top 10 biggest snowstorms in 8 different northeastern cities. And it goes back to the 1800s on the left. But what you can see is there's a cluster, a growing cluster, as you go towards more present time. So it appears that we're also seeing the bigger snowstorms happening more recently. So that's also going to get offset eventually by the warming, of course. But for now, we're seeing an increase in the frequency of these heavy snowstorms because the storms have more moisture to work with. All right, you've seen maps of global warming, I'm sure, but this one's kind of different, and I think it's much more informative. So these colors are showing us how different areas on the Earth are warming compared to the globe as a whole. So where it's blue, it means it's warming slower than the globe as a whole, and where it's red, it's warming faster. So obviously you can see that the land is warming much faster than the oceans, but what really stands out is that the Arctic is warming so much faster than anywhere else. The Arctic now is warming about 4 times faster than the globe as a whole, and it's accelerating. Connected with that, and partly responsible for that, is the loss of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. This animation, you can see Greenland down on the bottom left there, Norway is on the bottom right, Alaska would be on the upper left. These colors are showing you the thickness of the sea ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. The darker colors are thin ice, and the bright colors are thick ice, up to about 4 meters for the brighter colors. And this goes back to just 1979, so we're talking 40 years here. What you can see very clearly is that back in the early part of this animation, there's a lot of white light colors, so a lot more thick ice. And as we get up to present day, there's basically none left. So that's the thickness. If we multiply the thickness times the change in the area coverage of the ice, we get the volume. We've seen in the last 40 years, the volume of the sea ice decrease by 75% in 40 years. We call this one of the canary in the coal mine variables because the sea ice really accumulates all of the forcing, all of the factors, all the winds and the heat and the clouds and all of the things that affect it and give us a very good picture of what actually is happening. And it's not a good picture. And the reason I'm harping about the Arctic so much, not only because I just really am fascinated with the place, but it's very important, this warming of the Arctic relative to the rest of the globe. And to illustrate this, I want you to think about a layer of air. Whoops, let me go back a whole bunch. Keep going back. Okay. All right. I want you to think about a layer of air extending from here in Marion up to the Arctic, right? That blue line there. Now, the air here is warmer than it is in the Arctic, and we know that air expands when it warms. So this layer is going to be thicker here than it is up in the Arctic. So if you were sitting on top of that layer and looking towards the north, it would look like you were looking down a hill, which in fact you would be. So the air on top of this layer wants to flow down that hill just like water wants to flow down the side of a mountain. And that's how we get a wind. The wind starts out flowing from south to north. There we go. But because the Earth is spinning, it gets turned to the right. Everything moving in the northern hemisphere gets turned to the right because of the spinning Earth. And that's what creates the jet stream. Okay, now think about the fact that the Arctic is warming so much faster. What's happening to the thickness of this layer? It's growing much faster in the Arctic than it is here. And so that hill is getting less steep. So the force driving that wind is getting weaker. And the jet stream, the west to east winds of the jet stream are getting weaker too. And we know that when the jet stream is weak, it is more easily deflected from its west to east path by things like mountain ranges or even blobs of hot water out in the Pacific Ocean. So the result is we see the jet stream taking these bigger waves as it goes around the northern hemisphere. And think back to the very beginning of when I started showing you those extreme weather events with those big waves in the jet stream. So the idea here is that as the Arctic warms so much faster and is continuing to do so, we're expecting to see these wavy patterns in the jet stream happening more often. And indeed, we have evidence now that this is occurring. And again, why do we care about these waves? Well, we already talked about the fact that the jet stream separates the cold air to the north from the warm air to the south, so that if you've got one of these big ridges, then you're going to be in a warmer than normal situation, and if you're experiencing a trough, then you're going to be in the cold air. But in addition to that, the shape of the wave itself creates the high pressure areas and the low pressure areas that we would see on a weather map on TV. So this part of the wave here, where the winds are coming out of the northwest, that's where you would find high pressure, blue skies, dry conditions. And on the other side, over there, is where we would find our stormy conditions. So when we get a nor'easter here in New England, this is pretty much what the jet stream looks like. And again, when the waves are big, like the ones I showed you, associated with this extreme events going on right now, they tend to move much more slowly. So as we get these wavier patterns in the jet stream, the expectation is we're going to have these very persistent weather patterns happening more often too. Now sadly, the real jet stream is just a god-awful mess. It's got swirls, it doesn't look anything like that schematic I just showed you. These are actual winds over about a 3-week period or so that have been sped up. And it shows you just how chaotic these winds are. You see these swirls, you see the waves changing shape and moving along, and sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big. So you can imagine how hard it might be to actually try to study what's happening with the jet stream. Are we seeing these waves getting bigger or not? But you can see when they're small, like right now, they do run right across the continent, and then when they get big like this, they tend to get stuck in place much longer. So that's one of the main concepts I want you to take home tonight is when we get these really wavy patterns, I want you to all go home and check out the jet stream and see if it's really wavy, and you'll go, oh yeah, okay, this weather pattern we got, it's going to be around a long time. Speaking of which, here's our jet stream today. So, I wanted you to see what we're actually looking at. I wish I had a pointer. But you can see that there's a ridge over the western states where we're seeing the heat wave happening in Arizona right now. You can see the little trough in the jet stream over the Appalachian Mountains roughly. That's what's causing our muggy, sort of periodic thunderstorms coming through that we've seen, literally for the whole month of July so far. Then as you go farther east, there's another ridge off of the coast that's bringing a lot of heat up into Greenland and that area. And you know that there's a major heat wave happening in Europe as well. There's a ridge right there. And then if we click on it one more time, what we can see associated with these ridges and troughs in the jet stream right now are the differences in the temperature from what they would normally be this time of year. So places that are red are warmer than normal, and the blue places are colder than normal. And you clearly see how these ridges and troughs in the jet stream line up almost perfectly with where the heat waves are and where the cold temperatures are too. Wisconsin's had one of the coolest summers they've had in a long time. All right, I told you I'd get back to the ocean here. And now that you know what temperature anomalies look like, so differences from normal, this is the same thing but for the oceans. All of that red there is where the ocean water is warmer than normal. In some places by a huge amount. And I want you to focus on the North Atlantic there. This is our backyard, right? So this is looking at the North Atlantic surface temperatures going back to 1982, okay? Just for the North Atlantic, you can see there's a general increase, but look at the spike over on the right. The warmth of the Atlantic this year is so far in uncharted territory, it's got us really worried. And you can also see that this is La Nina 3.4 to La Nina 3.4. We all know, I'm sure, that there's a pretty strong El Nino brewing. And that, generally, when we have an El Nino situation, we expect to have a relatively quiet hurricane season in the Atlantic side. We don't think that's going to happen this year. There's so much heat in the Atlantic Ocean that it's probably going to overwhelm any influence that El Nino has. And so we're expecting now a pretty active hurricane season. So that's a problem. But you can see that there's a big ocean heat wave, we call it, in the North Pacific as well. That's been there for months. And remember we talked about the record-breaking snowfall in the West this past winter. Well, we were in a La Nina situation this winter, and have been for 3 years in a row, which is weird all by itself. But generally, when we're in a La Nina winter, the West Coast is high and dry. And that was true for the previous years of the La Nina, but not last year. And I think it's because of that big blob of hot water sitting in the North Pacific. Because we know that when we get these oceanic heat waves, we tend to get the formation of a ridge in the jet stream because it's pumping all of this heat into the air. That's bulging that hill in the atmosphere. And what's downwind of that ocean heat wave? A trough over the west. So La Nina lost out to that ocean heat wave in the North Pacific. Well, in case you're not thoroughly depressed, I'll throw a little more at you. Here's what the world's glaciers have been doing over the last several decades. Losing that ice in the land, on land, that ice, when it melts, goes directly into the ocean and contributes directly to sea level rise. That's a big deal for us living around here. The other really disturbing thing that's happening right now is that in the Antarctic, so the southern hemisphere, that this is showing the anomalies in the amount, the aerial coverage of the sea ice around Antarctica. Each little squiggle is a different year, and it starts in January and it goes through December. So it's showing how the amount of sea ice varies in Antarctica through a typical annual cycle. That red line is what it's doing right now. For those of you who know anything about statistics, it's about 5 standard deviations below normal. So when sea ice melts, it doesn't directly affect sea level rise because it's already floating. But the reason, I mean, this is winter down there, right? The ice is supposed to be growing right now. And it's growing way slower than it should be. And it's because the ocean is so warm. This is really worrying because, yes, the sea ice isn't growing very fast, but that warmer water is what's melting the Antarctic glaciers from underneath. And when we lose that ice from the Antarctic ice shelf and the glaciers that come off it, that does affect sea level rise. But even more important, those glaciers are basically holding that ice up onto the Antarctic continent. And by losing that ice, it's like removing a barrier, and it's going to let it flow even faster. So we're very concerned about certain areas of the Antarctic ice sheet that are starting to move faster, and it's already starting to contribute a lot more to sea level rise. I put this in here for Deborah. She's a rut-roll girl. And I came across this quote by one of my friends, actually, a colleague of mine at Yale, and he said, "This could be a major Scooby-Doo rut-roll finding for people living on the coast." So this is a real concern for the sea level rise situation. And you may not know this, but sea level rise does not happen uniformly around the globe. It actually varies a lot. This graph here is showing you how the trends in sea level rise vary around the world. So the places that are red mean that it's rising much faster than the places that are in the light yellows. There's nowhere that it's not rising. There's one little spot down around the Southern Ocean there. But basically it's rising everywhere. And off of our coast, you can see North America there. We're in one of the places where it's rising the fastest. All right, wrapping up. So we've talked about a lot of things. What are the major concerns for us living here in coastal New England? Of course, we talked about sea level rise. That's a big one. We all know about that. But really, sea level rise is relatively gradual. We can deal with that. But here in Marion, our biggest concern is going to be the next big hurricane. It's on top of sea level rise, but really we have to think about, okay, we got to prepare for that next big hurricane because we haven't had a bad one in a while, and a lot of people have kind of forgotten just how bad it can be. The rising ocean temperatures, and if they're warming very fast off of our coast, are affecting various fisheries. There are hardly any lobsters out here anymore. Thank goodness there's still some in Maine, so we're not going without our lobster rolls this summer, but it's having a big impact on the fisheries all along the eastern seaboard. We're seeing more toxic algae blooms, and that warmer water, as I mentioned, is fueling stronger storms. We talked about the heavy precipitation events. This was in spades this week up in Vermont and New York and even in western Massachusetts. And I mentioned the heavier snowfalls, perhaps. We'll also see more intense droughts. I mean, it's really a story of extremes in both directions. You probably remember last summer we were talking about drought. It was really dry here last summer. Not so now. And this, of course, connects directly into what Liz was talking about, the agriculture around here, the cranberry bogs, but also our freshwater supplies. And then there's the fires. We've been spared here pretty much, but elsewhere it's been a pretty tough situation. Yeah, we're worried about the next hurricane. And there's a lot of reasons to be concerned because this warming water is allowing hurricanes to track farther north because they need to have warm ocean water, and if the water's warmer, then that means they can maintain their tropical characteristics farther north. The season is getting longer. We had a couple in May. We're starting to see them more often in November and December. And we're also seeing their paths take less normal paths. Sandy was the poster child for that. Okay. I promised Kate I'd end on some good news. Well, I've got a little. This is how renewable energy has been increasing over time, going back only to 2017. But we are seeing a big uptick in the amount of renewable energy coming online, mainly from solar and wind. That's the end of the good news. The bad news is we have so far to go. So this is where all of the global energy has been coming from, going back to the beginning of the 1800s. You can see that oil, coal, and methane, let's not call it natural gas anymore. Sounds kind of nice. We don't call it natural gas anymore. It's methane. Methane. That. And there's renewables down there. It's coming along, but like I said, we got a long way to go, and we just have to make this change. And how can we get there? What can we do? Well, there's a lot we can do. There really is. Yep, you know about your personal choices that you can make, and that is all good stuff. But we need to really attack it from a much more systemic level. Starting with our community government. Just getting involved on a committee, run for an office in your town. We need to do a lot just locally, and that really will make a much bigger difference. We've done a pretty good job here in Marion, actually, of identifying our vulnerable property. Norm's here somewhere. He's been a big pusher of, and Eileen too on the planning board, helping the town really figure out where our vulnerabilities are, looking for grant money, building new sewage pumping stations and things like that. That's stuff that we're all working on. And we're making progress, but like I said, there's more to do. We've been actually transitioning Marion quite well over to renewable energy. I don't know if you know, but all of Marion's municipal electricity comes from those wind turbines over on Route 25 on Marion Cape. Those 4 wind turbines there, they supply all of our municipal electricity at a 20% discount off of the rate that we generally pay. We get a check every month from the company that put in those wind turbines. And we're already up to something like $800,000 over the last 6-7 years of being on this municipal energy thing. So we've actually done pretty well around here. But there's more to do, and we could certainly use a lot of help, and it's amazing how much of a difference one person can make. And then we get up to the state and national government level. This is where it gets a little more depressing. But, really we need to get out there and vote for the leaders that get this problem, that have a plan to really get at it. There's a lot we can do. One of the quickest things we could do that would make a big difference would be to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. We spend $600 billion a year, just in the United States, on subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And it's something like $3 trillion globally. I mean, that is just insane. And they're making record profits right now. Think what we could do with all that money, putting towards renewable energy and education and other things. So better food security and all kinds of good things. We need to not only have carrots, like incentives for renewable energy, but we also need to have bigger sticks. We need to charge for carbon that gets put into the atmosphere so that there's a price you gotta pay if you're gonna do that. And a really big one that you don't hear too much about is we need to stop cutting down all the trees, because they're the best way the Earth has of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. You can't cut down all the trees. And thank you for being here and educating yourself. So now go home and speak up and talk about all this stuff with your family, even though it's hard. And again, thank you so much for having me. And I think this kind of all boils down to that statement at the top there. What we're trying to do, there's sort of two sides to this coin. We're trying to avoid the unmanageable, which means we can't keep going on that spike of temperature that I showed you that went from 20,000 years ago, and now we're going completely off the rails. We've got to do everything we can do to make that spike less spiky. And then we've got to deal with the changes that we know are going to continue. So no matter what we do in the next 20 years, we are going to continue to see increasing extreme weather. We are going to see sea level keep rising. So we have to get busy getting ready for those changes. That's the managing the unavoidable. So thanks, and I'd love to answer any questions.
If anybody has any questions, you can open the floor. We've got some time.
There's another one here.
Okay, we definitely do. Mark?
So I can just start.
Hi, Mark.
For Jeff. Nice to see you, Jennifer. Thank you for being here. I'm curious about the data that we have that goes back 20,000 years with temperature and with carbon, in the atmosphere. Carbon, that we can sort of do cores and look at samples in the Earth. How do we know what the temperature was 10,000 years ago?
So there's a lot of ways. Of course, we didn't have thermometers back then, but there are many ways that we can use what are called proxy records. So things like tree rings, the kinds of animals that lived in the mud down at the bottom of lakes, the various isotopes that are in ice cores when we drill, say, into the Greenland ice sheet or the Antarctic ice sheet. There are many things that can be used to get quite a good estimate of what the temperature was going back even 800,000 years.
Question on a local. Quick question on a local knowledge. Historically, we always had the southwest wind that always came in. And we understood that the land heats up and it came in. It was like clockwork that's coming in. We very seldom saw southeasterlies. Now we're seeing a lot of southeasterlies. And I'm sure you have a better explanation than I might have, so I was kind of wondering why that's happened, why it's so often.
Yeah, so, human anecdotal memories are generally not all that great. But in this case, there is actually evidence that what you just said is correct. The southwest winds of Buzzards Bay have not been as reliable in the last decade or so compared to what they used to be. And part of the reason for that, in fact, this year has been particularly true. The Bermuda High, the big high pressure area that generally sits kind of over Bermuda, Azores, and basically drives the winds in a clockwise direction in the North Atlantic, has been much weaker than normal this year. And it's been shifting northward. And so that shift northward has taken some of that southwesterly flow around the bottom of the high, basically, and taken it offshore a little bit and also farther north. So, yeah. But this year is particularly true, and that has been actually pointed to as one of the main factors for all the warming in the Atlantic this year. Why the ocean waters are so warm in the Atlantic, because when the Bermuda High is strong, it tends to mix the surface waters up more, and so by having weaker winds, those surface waters can get warmed up more by the sun.
Dr. Francis, this is the second time I've heard this in almost a year. I'm starting to learn some of it, so you're doing a great job.
Hopefully it's a little different from
No, it's picking up, but I have a couple more questions. They both relate to the Gulf Stream, the jet stream.
Jet stream, okay.
Gulf
Stream's in the ocean.
Yep, got you. You mentioned that the unmanageable, the extreme weather. What do you mean by a long time? Like, is it a month? What's a long time in that kind of pattern? My second question is, what's happening in what we would call the eastern hemisphere of the world with that same jet stream? Like, you mentioned
Asia?
Canada and Mexico. What's going on over in Asia?
Yeah.
Thank
Okay, two good questions. Yeah, so a long time is a mushy thing. So some of the research that I've been doing has actually come up with a definition for a long duration event. And we call it something that lasts at least 4 days. So, but when we look at the pattern in the jet stream, we're saying, okay, the jet stream is basically staying in almost the exact same configuration for at least 4 days. And that means that the weather that it's creating, the high pressures and the low pressures, are all basically staying in the same place for at least 4 days. You know, when you go out to the West Coast, though, I mean, the drought that they were having was about 5 years long overall. So there's different answers, I would say, depending on, you know, whether you're looking at the actual weather that's being experienced in a particular season, or whether you're looking at long-term trends in things like drought and water resources and stuff like that. So over in Eurasia, is that what you were talking about? What's going on over in that side of the world, in the northern hemisphere?
Sure. You mentioned when you said the polar vortex split, I saw one arrow going to the other side.
Yeah. So they've been having some really interesting weather changes as well. And there's a feature in the winter weather over Siberia called the Siberian high pressure area. It can be extremely strong, and it's when they get there. I mean, when they get cold there, it is like brutal cold. It's down to -50, -60 Fahrenheit. And what we're noticing, and I said that we're seeing the polar vortex break up more often, it's connected to the sea ice loss that's happening just north of Scandinavia and far western Russia. There's an area there where the sea ice has been disappearing the fastest. So when you lose the sea ice there, that ice is really bright and white. So when you change it into open water instead, a lot more of the sun's heat goes into the water, warms up the water, and builds up that hill in the atmosphere. It's all about, you know, the heating distribution around the globe, how these highs and lows and ridges and troughs are starting to be affected by these differences in the heating. So that particular spot there, it's called the Barents-Kara Sea, has been losing lots of sea ice. It's been warming up probably the fastest of anywhere in the Arctic. And it just happens to be sitting right under the swirling winds of the stratospheric polar vortex.
So in the fall, after it's been exposed to the sun all summer long, and a lot of that heat's gone into the water, in the fall when it gets cold again, that heat reemerges and goes into the atmosphere, and it creates literally a heat dome. We've been talking about heat domes on TV the last month, 2 months. It's like a heat dome there. And that heat dome acts like a poke to the stratospheric polar vortex. So it's up there spinning around like a top, and this heat dome keeps bumping up against it, and it starts to destabilize that top. And so the polar vortex starts to wobble, it starts to move and stretch, and if that heat dome lasts long enough and it's strong enough, it'll destabilize the polar vortex and get it to split. So we've seen a very clear tendency for this to happen, and then one of those lobes of the polar vortex drops down over Eurasia as well, and it's been causing some very severe winters, especially in the central and eastern parts. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you.
Complicated stuff. Sue.
One more.
Oh, there's more over here.
Oh, good. Thank you for this really superb discussion of a very complex system. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You and I have talked about our beloved Southwest wind in Buzzards Bay, and you may remember that really registered, anchored, which was Miles Standish Forest, and the trees there, and the evapotranspiration, and the upward currents, and the biotic pump resulting from all that, really sustains the steady Southwest wind in Buzzards Bay. I love it. Could you please talk about the effect of trees on the global system, particularly with regard to the boreal forest and the Northeast Amazon?
Yeah, well, you'd be better talking about that than me, actually. That's your stuff. But, generally, trees play an incredibly important role, especially in the living part of the Earth's climate system. They breathe oxygen into the atmosphere, and they take carbon dioxide out of the air. So, and each individual tree is made out of carbon, basically, and so they also store a lot of carbon in their trunks, in their branches, in their root systems. And so when we remove trees, we're not only removing this natural way that carbon gets taken out of the atmosphere in a big way, we're also taking that carbon that's in the tree, and it's either going to get burned, or it's just going to rot, and all that carbon is going to end up in the atmosphere. So it's like a double whammy by losing or cutting down, the active sense, the trees. And of course, the heat waves and the drought and the fires are exacerbating this in many areas. In Canada this year, like we talked about, it's just horrific. Somebody's going to calculate how much carbon is going into the atmosphere because of all the fires up there, but it's going to be a very large number. And it takes a long time for them to grow back, and we don't have that time anymore. I think,
Jen,
yeah.
very basic question. What is the difference between CO2 and methane and oxygen in terms of, do they directly absorb energy, or do they reflect energy so that it can't get away?
Good question. Yes. So carbon dioxide and methane are both greenhouse gases. Oxygen is not. Every gas in the atmosphere absorbs only certain wavelengths of energy. Greenhouse gases are the ones that absorb what we call infrared energy. So the energy that comes from the sun is very short wavelength. Okay, we call that solar energy or visible light. And that passes right through the atmosphere for the most part. And it goes all the way to the surface unless it gets reflected by a cloud. Goes to the surface, warms the surface, and then the surface of the Earth, because it's so much cooler than the sun, it emits a very different type of energy with much longer wavelengths, and that's what's infrared energy. So it's all light in a way, but of different wavelengths, and different gases in the atmosphere absorb energy or light at different wavelengths. Greenhouse gases
carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, they all absorb infrared energy. And by doing that, they're taking this heat that's absorbed, that's emitted from the surface of the Earth, and they absorb it and then re-emit it right back. And that's what acts like this blanket on the Earth. So the more greenhouse gases you have in the atmosphere, it's just like putting a thicker blanket on your bed. It traps more heat.
Jennifer, Antarctica is indeed melting, as you.
The sea ice is, and the land ice.
All goes in the water because it's sitting on top of land. Excuse me, and 60% of the fresh water in the world. How long do you think that takes? And are we talking 10 or 20 feet of sea level rise here in New England as a result? Or will that not be equilibrate around the globe? And that shouldn't be as alarming to us as it sounds.
Oh, you should be very alarmed. So Greenland has about 20 feet of sea level contained in its ice cap, and the Antarctic ice sheet has about 60 feet of sea level in its ice cap. Greenland's already the single biggest contributor to sea level rise, because it's melting not only from underneath like Antarctica is now, but it's also melting from above. And that's because it's much warmer in Greenland and in the Arctic than it is in the Southern Ocean, so over Antarctica. So the surface of Antarctica hasn't started to melt, and it won't for a while because we'd have to warm up several degrees for the surface to start melting in a big way. So Greenland is actually a bigger issue in the near term. And as I said, it's already moved into first place in terms of contributors to sea level rise. The second place is ocean expansion. So when you warm the oceans, like we talked about, water expands. And that's the second biggest contributor to sea level rise.
So what is all this going to do to our agriculture and our food supply?
Yes.
Well, we've got increasing frequencies of heat waves, increasing frequencies of droughts, increasing frequencies of heavy downpours. All of those things are changing what was always considered normal by farmers growing whatever it is they grow. And farmers get this, because they pay a lot of attention to the conditions in their region where they're growing whatever it is. And so, even though you think of, kind of the middle of the country being kind of right-leaning, the farmers are actually very attuned to this, and they understand, and they see with their very own eyes that there's big changes happening in their growing situation. So they're shifting, and it's not just adapting to the conditions, but they're also changing the way they manage their soils. There are better ways to grow things. There are better things than chemical fertilizers to use because they're a big source of nitrous oxide, which is one of the greenhouse gases. So they're doing a better job of managing their water. So they're on top of this, but they've got their work cut out for them. But yeah, we're going to see more problems. Never mind the national security situation and the political instabilities around the world.
Yep. One more question up here.
She's in charge.
So you mentioned that oceans help to cool the earth by absorbing heat. How deep has the heat absorption occurred in the oceans? So the oceans are, in some cases, 2,000, 3,000 feet deep. How far down does this heat absorption go?
Yeah, so that plot I showed was for the top 2,000 meters of ocean, right? So that's like top 7,000 feet. So it's already affecting very deep parts of the ocean. And that's concerning because it's going to take a long time for that heat to come out of the ocean. Even if we were able to level off the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, stop the warming on the surface, we've still got all this heat that's been stored in the ocean. It's going to take a really long time for that to to come out. And that's why I said we're looking at many, many more decades of sea level rise because of all this heat that's already been absorbed in the ocean.
Jen, on hurricanes, we've had several critical situations in recent years. How effective are the predictive tools and the tracking systems now, and what's coming our way?
That is such a good question. So, we're getting really quite good at predicting the tracks of hurricanes, but it really depends on the large-scale situation. So, a hurricane forecasting model has a hurricane in it, and there's, all this numerical programming that simulates the hurricane itself. But that hurricane is embedded in the large-scale wind patterns, like the jet stream. And so you not only have to predict how the hurricane's going to change relative to, say, the sea surface temperature and changes in the shear in the atmosphere and all these factors that affect how fast a hurricane grows, but you also have to do a really good job of predicting what the jet stream's going to do. And there are times when it's very straightforward. It's a very solid forecast to see what the wind patterns are. Like Hurricane Calvin right now, for example, in Hawaii, 10 days ago, it had, all the models just had it zooming right towards Hawaii. But there are other times when the winds are very weak and, kind of just milling around, and it makes it much harder to predict where any kind of a tropical storm is going to go. So the other aspect is the intensity of the storm, which we're way less good at. And the problem is we don't have good measurements of what the temperature of the ocean is below the surface. How much heat is stored in, say, the top 100 meters of the ocean, because that's where the energy comes from to fuel that storm. And so until we have really good measurements of that, intensity forecasts are going to remain much more challenging. But we're getting better all the time.
I think we have time for one more. Is there one question from this corner? Any other questions? Okay, Mark, you started us, finish up.
I have one more. The graphics that you presented were amazing and conveyed the cause and effect of all these different environmental factors. I'm curious, there must be dynamic three-dimensional models which show this and communicate it effectively, particularly with younger generations. Can you tell us where we might locate three-dimensional models of the same kinds of relationships between polar vortexes and jet streams and thermal conditions?
So when you say model, you're talking about a schematic.
No, I'm talking about a dynamic CAD model.
Oh.
Where you can actually maybe even make changes in the model to see cause and effect.
I don't know any of it off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I'd have to do some digging around to see what I could find. I mean, it's so complicated that it would be difficult for you to take one of these simulation tools, models on your computer in a three-dimensional atmosphere and make sense of what you're seeing, honestly, without really studying meteorology. It is very complicated. Just things like when water vapor condenses into a cloud and the heat that gets released in the atmosphere, that is a process all unto itself that's very complicated. Cloud formation and cloud movement and precipitation, all those things are extremely difficult to simulate correctly. So I'm not sure that, unless you're in a master's class in a university where that it would be all that helpful. I mean, you can see simulations of how a thunderstorm goes through its life cycle, things like that are relatively easy to see. So something like that might come close, but the jet stream by itself is, I showed you just what the winds look like, but if you looked at it in 3 dimensions, you're you're looking at a big mess.
Thank you, Jen. Remind everybody that this is part of a series, a climate series, so we'll be meeting in here again on August 15th. Again, it's a Tuesday night, where Dave Riley will be talking about his research and how climate change is affecting the oceans, specifically looking at whales and seabirds and salmons and the sort of ecology of the ocean. So please join us again. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, please get signed up for our newsletter and make sure you get an annual report and stay in touch with us, please. Thank you.